Okay, so thanks to all of you for being here. I think that you are in Sweden enjoying fika right now. I'm in Pittsburgh, not realizing it was a holiday for my children. My 4 children are downstairs, so I'm going to pray to the Swedish god of conferences that they are entertained by YouTube for the next hour and a half. So I apologize in advance if there are any intrusions during our discussion today. So it is a great honor to have these 3 distinguished colleagues with us. And I know we're waiting for Mohammed Qadam Shah, who is in Seattle. I think it is an ungodly early hour there in Seattle. So I imagine he'll be joining us any minute to talk about local governance issues in Afghanistan. So we know that it's been just a little more than 6 months since the Taliban took control of the government in Afghanistan and have begun to impose their form of social and political order. And while many aspects of Taliban governance have received attention, with specifically issues related to gender, freedom of speech, freedom of association, we've paid attention to high-profile arrests, looking at amnesty and whether the Taliban is really keeping its word and not retaliating against former government officials. These are all national level issues that we've kept our eye on. And of course, we are looking at the devastating humanitarian situation that has overcome the country in these past 6 months. Things were not good in Afghanistan before this, but the withdrawal of international aid and assistance has plummeted the country into really new depths of despair. So really just delighted to have this group of colleagues. Cannot think of anyone who has better insights, longer experience into these dynamics than the colleagues we have assembled here. So rather than have everyone just present a few minutes to discuss aspects of Taliban local governance, which really remains, I think, for many of us, a mysterious black box, trying to understand how the Taliban will govern, how they will rule, and then how the international community can respond to this. I thought it would be a good opportunity for us to sort of meet together and discuss these issues. So I'm going to go one panelist at a time and really ask questions and then really encourage the panelists to engage with one another. So I'll ask each of you individually a question. You'll have a few minutes to respond. And then after that, I'd really encourage all of us to, I'll throw out some more questions and encourage the panelists to engage with one another, not hesitate to interrupt. It is fika hour in Sweden, and so that means it's time to talk and time to discuss. So Timur, I'm going to start with you. I was wondering if you could share with us just your sort of overview of where things stand with Taliban governance right now. What has been their attitude towards subnational governance? You know, you worked for many years in the government. You were responsible for drafting many aspects of subnational governance policy. Can you tell us whether the Taliban have adhered to old policies, whether they've set out a new course over the past 6 months? What do we know about the state of Taliban governance?
Thank you, Professor Murtazashvili. Hello to everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. And I also, at the mercy of God, that my child, who is just sitting on the, lying down on the bed, watching videos, will not disturb me too during this session. So thank you for that question, very relevant. The short answer to that is that we don't know where they're going. We don't know what their vision, broader vision for stabilization is. What is their broader vision for state-society relationship is, and where they're heading to, and how they're going to manage their own internal division. What we know so far is that what we have inherited is a fragmented order with significant level of fragility and division within the Taliban, where local commanders at the provincial and district levels have captured subnational administrative units. And through those units, they are providing privileges, positions to their fighters, to their clients, and anyone who is loyal to them. And this is very much a one group domination or a one-party domination with significant level of internal conflict and division. Secondly, in terms of the structure of the state, what we know is that the old IDLG, Independent Directorate of Local Governance, no longer exists as it used to be. They have taken significant part of the key functions and authority of IDLG within the Ministry of Interior, and also within the Office of Administrative Affairs in the palace. Now, let me just say that this is not new. IDLG was used as an extended arm of the incumbent presidents and rulers to expand their dominance across the country. So the communists used it, through the Ministry of Interior. And during President Karzai and Ghani, IDLG was used very much as a political tool within a broader political marketplace to negotiate power dynamics with subnational clients, all the way to the village level. Also, it's important to say that during the very last year of President Ghani, there was internal conversation to shift IDLG into the palace, and significant functions and authority of IDLG when it came to appointments and coordination of administrative units, 35 provincial governors' offices, 384 formal, informal district governors' offices, 165 municipalities, and 45,000 plus villages and village councils that never materialized. Those will go to the palace, and that will function as the dominant arm of the president. That didn't materialize back then. So what we are now seeing is Taliban taking most of the appointments authority to the Ministry of Interior, the administrative side to the palace. What has remained is the municipality. And again, we don't have a deputy, we don't have a head of IDLG that would deal with municipalities and most of the key functions of municipalities, including the key program, the Citizen Charter program, that used to deal directly with the nahiyas in the key municipalities. Let me end there, but I invite other colleagues to make comments.
Great. Khalid, I don't know if you want to add to this discussion of local governance. The Swedish Committee has a very long and distinguished history inside of Afghanistan as one of the most active NGOs providing both humanitarian relief and long-term development assistance in the country. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your views on the trajectories of local governance. Timur has indicated that what we are seeing right now is really continuity with the past in terms of the way the central government deals with subnational authority. I was wondering if you might want to say a few words about that, as well as tell us how the Swedish Committee is engaging with subnational governance or with local governance as it works in Afghanistan.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Jennifer. I'm also very glad to be part of this policy roundtable discussion. To a little bit give it a background, unfortunately, the cumulative effects of conflict, internal displacement, COVID-19, drought that has been ongoing since many years, and then finally that political and economic collapse. All these have drastically contributed to the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. And sadly, the UN predicts that 24.4 million will require humanitarian assistance in 2022 out of that 34 or 35 million population. And this is a very sharp increase of 33% compared to 2021. And the situation has affected all sectors, more notably the public service delivery sectors of the state, namely health and education. And among them, unfortunately, girls' education is one of the most affected. The women employment is most affected. So the country is now in political, humanitarian, and development crisis. What is quite worrying also is that Taliban do not own the crisis. And they kind of are attributing the crisis to the former government and the international community. Partly it is true that this whole humanitarian crisis did not start. It started before the collapse due to that ongoing conflict, due to governance deficiencies, more specifically in rural Afghanistan, drought, internal displacements, and all these contributed, started earlier, but the unexpected and dramatic collapse have exacerbated the crisis. And also one of the underreported areas is women's access to justice. Women do not have access to the justice due to the reason that before partly the Ministry of Women Affairs was also playing a role in that. And recently there is no longer Ministry of Women Affairs, and also women in the government structure do not have that representation. So all this has contributed to that political, humanitarian, and development crisis. Over the past 2 or 3 months, there are also quite promising indications of response by the international community to address the crisis. The sanction regime has eased up in certain aspects. The general license issued by the Treasury Department of the US, and also the World Bank has released more than $1 billion US dollars as part of the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund to respond to the more urgent needs within education, health, agriculture, and also revival of livelihoods. And also soon during this month, there will be the digital pledging summit as part of response to the UN appeal of 4.4. All these are quite good moves, and they will help alleviate the humanitarian crisis. But at the same time, this is not sufficient. The humanitarian response is not a holistic and collective response to the situation in Afghanistan. The political, humanitarian, and development crises need to be addressed in tandem to be able to achieve those synergistic effects. So there is a need for a simultaneous, more holistic and comprehensive response to the situation in Afghanistan. When it comes to the humanitarian response and the international community's response, one of the aspects that is quite important to highlight, that this response quite often results in establishing parallel support structures. And those parallel support structures is not a sustainable and holistic response to the situation, because it can never replace the state institutions' capacity and response. So it will never. And also, the humanitarian response alone is not, if a phased development assistance is not reintroduced, because there is great risk of continued state institutions collapse. by establishing these parallel systems. So both on local level and on central level, there is a need for a more pragmatic engagement with the de facto authorities by the international community in order to find ways and mechanisms of continued state institutions collapse that are the ownership of the Afghan people and not a specific faction being in power in Afghanistan. Swedish Committee for Afghanistan also has been, as you referred to, Jennifer, has been engaged and stepped up its operations in health, education, rural development in order to respond not only to the humanitarian and emergency needs, but also on how to, in a more sustainable and longer term manner, engage with communities on local level. To ensure that continued ownership and of the development on the local level. Because our assessments in Swedish Committee also shows that the urban centers have also been affected by this political, humanitarian, and development crisis. But the most who suffer are the rural areas. And that's why there is a need to step up those humanitarian and development efforts in rural Afghanistan, but most importantly by engaging with de facto authorities on subnational level and also communities.
You know, before we go to Francis, I just want to follow up on something very briefly because it's a source of tension, I think, right now that we're seeing about how to best support Afghanistan, how to best support institutions, how to best support people. And so some in the international community are saying, no, the international community cannot support this government. The government is not legitimate. There is no government. They haven't declared, you know, as Timur said, they haven't declared a vision. They haven't declared a governance strategy. And so it's better to work with parallel structures because aid organizations can't support the government. They'll find themselves under sanction. You know, there's so many difficult legal issues. How best to support local governance? So you've talked about, you know, that the international community shouldn't support parallel structures and should continue to support the government. Can you tell us a little bit about what that might look like and maybe how the Swedish Committee is doing this, if I've understood you correctly?
Yeah, no, actually, let me clarify. I did not mean not to support the parallel structures, but the parallel structure pose those challenges. If the focus only is on supporting the parallel structures, that will in the longer term contribute to the continued state institutions collapse. More importantly, those the systems and procedures that have in the capacity that has been invested upon in the technical ministries of education, public health, rural development, those technical ministries that concern the public health services delivery. So that is one of the notable challenges. There is a need for finding ways and means of not further weakening and contributing to that continued state institutions collapse. And they can be explored. Like the stuff that are sitting in the Ministry of Education, majority of those staff are the public sector employees during the previous regime. They are working. So every individual employee in these technical ministries have not been replaced by Taliban. Of course, there are changes in the leadership and more those political positions, but the technical workforce still. And that quite often should not be taken as supporting and financing the Taliban government. There can be ways and means of looking into preserving those state public health service delivery state institutions. And they can be achieved through continued engagement and dialogue with the de facto authorities in making sure that this support does not contribute to the de facto authorities' aims. Or, yeah, of course, that legitimacy aspect is there. Despite that, the international community should engage in a constructive dialogue, not to contribute to the longer term incomplete state institutions collapse in the longer run.
Great, thank you. That was really insightful. And thinking about the lessons learned from the past, I think there's so many things that we must learn from the past 20 years, the past 40 years even, of this conflict in Afghanistan. And Francis, I'm going to turn to you now, and I'd really encourage everyone to take a look. Francis has written a fantastic report at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace that's taken stock of local governance assistance to Afghanistan. So if you want to understand, she's got extensive field experience inside of Afghanistan, as well as very high level policy experience, looking at these issues over a very long period of time. So I'd really encourage you to look at her very insightful report on this. So taking stock of what's happened, what do you think, Francis, are some of the rules the international community should learn from their past efforts to support or improve local governance in Afghanistan?
Thank you. And it's really a delight to be here with my fellow panelists and with all of you. So yes, I think it's high time, actually, that we take stock of our previous efforts to support local governance in Afghanistan, both because I think they still may be relevant in any future aid architecture that emerges, although it's very early days now under the Taliban regime. And second, and to GLD's mission in general, I think a lot of the patterns we saw of local governance assistance and donor local governance engagement that we saw in Afghanistan under the Republic are ones that we actually replicate, we on the international side replicate in many other conflict areas throughout the world and fragile states throughout the world. So I hope my comments are taken in that spirit, even though they're speaking of a bygone era. So a few key lessons that I would highlight, and then we can talk more about going forward. So I think it's worth noting that international community engagement on local governance in Afghanistan was big, was significant. And even as the overall international footprint went through various stages, waxed and waned, we collectively on the international side spent a tremendous amount of resources and often bandwidth trying to improve local governance and support local governance. So this wasn't a small undertaking. It was really hard for me to actually figure out numbers of how much money we collectively on the international side spent, but my research assistant and I came up with at least $2 billion, $2 billion since 2002, so large money. So what I see in all those efforts are a few recurrent patterns and a few recurrent shortcomings of all those efforts to reform local governance. So the first one I would highlight is that our donor assistance programs often hinged on this idea of helping to, quote, build trust or promote dialogue between citizens and society at the local level, or often between local level officials, local governance officials, and national level government officials. So basically this idea that Afghans needed to be taught how to talk to one another is a more, a sort of more overt way of saying it. I think that there was a lot of earnest effort that went into this, but I would say that these efforts primarily failed to acknowledge that the major barriers that were keeping particular members of the citizenry from talking to their government were not technical. It wasn't that they didn't know how to talk to one another. They didn't know how to find each other's phone number. It was political, and there were power dynamics involved. So For me, going back and taking the long view of local governance programming, basically since 2003 when it started, it's remarkable how recurrent, how many sort of the same programmatic models we see along those lines of fostering dialogue. The second recurrent theme that I see on our previous local governance efforts was a consistent effort to build capacity, particularly of subnational consultative bodies. So provincial councils, which were first elected in 2005, district level councils. As this group knows, district councils were never formally elected. They are called for in the previous constitution. They were never formally elected, but we did support a number of sort of quasi-district councils, DDAs, and other district level councils. So a lot of donor effort went into basically teaching members of these councils how to do their jobs. Unfortunately, the authorities and responsibilities of these subnational councils were never clear. So it was basically kind of play acting. What should a good counselor do without ever having clear mandate and authorities? That was particularly true on district level councils, but it was also true to a large degree in provincial councils, which, despite lots of conversations about provincial council laws over the year, often lacked clarity of authorities and responsibilities. So a lot of what I would call romantic capacity building, sort of, we're trying to build the capacity, but we don't know exactly what roles these councils are to play. The third pattern I would highlight, and then I'll turn it over for more discussion, we can get into it, but is that our donor programs often emphasize skills that I would say were more about being a good aid recipient or a good aid manager than they were really relevant to the real politics of local order. So they sort of assumed that, if you go back and read some of these program documents, it's remarkable, teaching locals to, keep minutes for meetings and, keep time, sort of a very Western notion of what skills were necessary to be a good local governance official. That really overlooked the reality that I think from the perspective of many in the Afghan periphery, the state's village level penetration was often viewed as unwelcome or predatory or extortive. It wasn't necessarily a good to have the state penetrate to the local level. And of course, Jennifer, you've written much more deeply on related issues. So I think, again, there was kind of this mismatch between our programmatic templates on local governance and what the reality was on the ground. Going forward, I think we can discuss more sort of how the international community can or should engage on local governance. It's early days, but I do think because we see these sort of patterns repeated in many other fragile states engagements in the donor community, it's worth us taking some lessons in their own right as well.
And absolutely, and I would imagine that it won't be very long before the international community is supporting local governance in Afghanistan one way or another. And one of the things I'm hearing, and we can continue that discussion later, is that the international community is actually continuing to support many of the subnational governance initiatives that it had supported over the past 20 years. It's just not doing them through the government, which introduces a whole lot of questions. But before we get to that, Timur, oh yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I just want to respond briefly to that because it's such an important point. And I think this gets to a broader misunderstanding that we on the international community have had a lot, is that we've sort of separated out our local governance programs and policies into one bin and our local service delivery, resource delivery, development projects into another bin, without recognizing that from a local perspective, questions of local governance and local resource distribution are totally interlinked. They're not sort of a separate thing. And so we can say, oh, we're not, the IDLG has been disbanded, we're not engaging on local governance, but local governance is resource distribution and security at the local level. So I think we've failed to learn that lesson.
Right, and it's amazing how quickly the international community, I mean, this is a concern I have, how quickly the international community is just going back to these models saying, and it's almost like pretending that like, oh, the government really didn't matter anyway, so we're just going to continue doing what we're doing. And I'm like, well, wasn't the government important to these programs, or that was just a fantasy as well. And the point that you're separating the technical from the political, that somehow local governance service delivery is like a technical issue, supporting district councils is a political issue. But as we know, and as you pointed out, these are all very political issues. And Afghans recognize this. So, following up on the big political question, Timur, I don't know if you're there right now, but we have, I want to get to sort of the big, meaty, uncomfortable political issues. You've talked about governance, you've talked about, groups who control things, monopolies of different groups. We have seen I'm distracted, he's so cute. What are we seeing in terms of center-local relations, political relations? A couple of weeks ago, we saw this uprising in Faryab province, where the Taliban installed or removed a local Uzbek commander from Faryab. Faryab, for those of our viewers who are not familiar, is an Uzbek majority area. There have been conflicts between the population and the government over appointments in the past, including the Ghani government. And the Taliban seem to be falling in the same patterns of appointing their co-ethnics, not respecting local desires for who should be running different areas. Even if that person is a Taliban commander, people seem to prefer a local Uzbek Taliban commander to one that was appointed from the outside. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that specific incident and how, are we seeing these kinds of things repeated throughout the country? Is this indicative of a broader pattern of things that we're going to see in Kandahar? We hear about the splits between the Haqqani factions and the Kandahari factions. What does this relationship look like right now between the center and local communities?
Thank you. And once again, I'm so sorry. He's not feeling well. Just before I get to that point, I think it's worth mentioning that there was a discrepancy between the key objective of local governance effort in Afghanistan was between the international community, what the international community was trying to achieve, and what the Afghan side was, what different factions of the Afghan side was trying to achieve. What was clear, it was that the US, became particularly interested from 2007 in establishment of IDLG. And again, let's not forget, this was an American push to establish IDLG for the purpose of stabilization. And that was the purpose of counterinsurgency, and how to use provincial and district governors' offices as a tool for the purpose of the counterinsurgency. Whereas for the Afghan government or different faction was how to expand patronage from Kabul to the provinces and districts of the country. So those two never worked. And again, the playing ground was let's window dress through technical issues, but each side could do their own politics when it came to politics of elections, resource distribution, and so forth. Now, coming to the issue of Faryab, and Faryab is an excellent window through which we could see essentially 300 years of failure of coming up with a smart way of managing a state-society relationship, and the failure of a political modality that would respond to the Afghan people's both political, societal structure, in terms of its vision to unify different cultures, different groups, different tribes who were consistently throughout history had grievances. I'll come back to this in
Khalid, I was wondering if you wanted to follow up on this point, if you're there, to say a little bit more about Faryab and the issues that are facing. Okay, Khalid's not here for now. Francis, I'm going to go back to you. We'll come back to Faryab in a second. Given this discussion, I think that Timur makes a really important point about the role of aid as patronage, right? So how the central government sees this. Okay, Khalid, you're here. I'm going to follow up Francis in a second, but Khalid, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about your perspective on these conflicts between the center and communities outside the country. We spoke about Faryab and what's happening there. We've spoken about potential factional fights between the Taliban and, within the Haqqanis, and this could devolve into some kind of disputes over local control, the Kandahari faction, a more Eastern faction. Will we begin to see geographic splits among the Taliban? Will we see the Taliban willing to appoint people, in a more bottom-up fashion? But looks like what the Taliban are doing is very much in line with previous governments, appointing people who they prefer, regardless of local preferences. And, I think it may be surprising for some of our viewers who are not familiar with the history of governance in Afghanistan, is that over the past 20 years, there were never local elections. There were never elections for subnational authorities. There were elections for provincial councils, but as Francis mentioned, these councils really had never had much authority vis-a-vis government authorities who were appointed from the center. For example, your provincial governor was appointed by the center, and then you would have a provincial council who really had no role to oversee what that very powerful provincial governor was doing. And so we're seeing a lot of continuity here, in this regard. And Khalid, I'm wondering if you could say just a little bit more about that. What you're seeing in terms of these kinds of relationships.
Of course, when it comes to the local governance, despite the achievements and improvements that were there over the past 20 years, they still were not responsive with that very centralized governance structure that was in place, which was kind of minimizing the possibilities for the provinces and communities to influence and see themselves in the government. That was a challenge in the past as well, and that right now can be seen very well into the political appointments of the Taliban as well, not only on central level, but on provincial level as well. If we look to the provincial governors that have been appointed by the Taliban, those local sensitivities, response to the local and diverse sensitivities that are there in the Afghan society, these appointments are not responsive to those sensitivities. And Faryab also could be, the Faryab demonstrations could very well reflect upon those deeply ingrained sensitivities that are there along the ethnic lines, along the regional lines, along those different lines, that those sensitivities are there, and they will remain to be there. And also within the Taliban, it also, there are certain indications that there are divisions within the Taliban movement as well, along more hardliners, moderate ones. One can link them to the ones who were representing Taliban in Doha political office, and also that kind of a soft wrestling also is ongoing within the Taliban between hardliners and the more moderate, the ones who were politically active in the office. But at the moment, what Taliban are also struggling with is on how to sustain their internal cohesion. And certain of these appointments and political and military decisions that they are making, they are being influenced by the importance of their internal cohesion to maintain. And that's why that we see mostly the government positions are divided between Haqqanis and the kind of Kandahari part of the Taliban.
So along these lines, I'm wondering if looking at these local governance issues, a question that we have from Pierre Landry. Hello, Pierre. Good to see you here. And I would encourage anyone who has questions to please put them in the Q&A. We want to hear from you about the questions that you have about Taliban governance. But a question that Pierre Landry has is about the role of opposition. Is there opposition at the local level? What do we know about opposition? And along these lines, I'm thinking that so many people have described, prior to August, there was this narrative that the Taliban have become a much more diverse movement, that the Taliban they are no longer a Pashtun-only movement, that they are much more diverse religiously. They even appointed some Hazara Shia district governors, at least one, but they were much more open to the ethnic minorities. We did see this in the South, that there were some commanders who came from ethnic minorities, like the one in Faryab, who was an ethnic Uzbek, who the Taliban removed. But since coming to power, a lot of people criticize the Taliban because they haven't diversified their appointments, that the critique, and people call them an ethno-fascist movement, that it just represents one ethnic group. They haven't appointed a much more inclusive government. At least to the best of my knowledge, I haven't seen, especially at the subnational level, haven't seen very diverse appointments. I'm wondering, Khalid, if you could tell us a little bit more about that, about the inclusivity of the government, about, whether you see the Taliban as an ethnic movement. Is it a religious movement? How is it governing? And then if you could tell us a little bit about the opposition and the way the opposition has taken shape. And Timur, if you're around, you're free to chime in here as well. Yeah. Oh, Timur, maybe you want to take that. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Again, I had to.
No worries.
So let me come back to the Faryab and then link it with your question right now. So what we saw in Faryab is a microcosm of what has happened in Afghanistan in the last 3 centuries, essentially, in how we failed to come up with a smart way of governing Afghanistan that is inclusive of Afghanistan's diverse societal structures, culture, and so forth. And of course, a tribal structure, which is quite egalitarian, as Barfield has talked about in detail, how a hierarchical state structure versus a tribal egalitarian structure has produced cycles of instability in Afghanistan. And that is something that we have seen in the country from my own work in the government. What we saw are three key areas where we failed miserably, and again, the Taliban are making those same mistakes again and again, and we're not learning from those. One is voice representation. We haven't been, as a nation, we haven't been effective in terms of giving voice and representation to communities. We talk a lot about communities, but we haven't dealt with the issue of political representation. The only representation that was inclusive of the entire history of Afghanistan was village level council that was implemented through a program, not village councils that were in the constitutions. But then those never materialized to the district level, provincial level, and all the way to the center. So overall centralization of power in Kabul, versus historical grievances in places like Panjwai, Kandahar, where you have multiple tribes and historically they are in conflict with one another over voice and representation. With that comes the issue of containing conflict. In Afghanistan, historically, a smaller scale conflict at the village level has led to national level crisis. Let's take the example of 2016 Uruzgan, where in 2 hours, 72 checkpoints shifted from the Taliban, from the Republic to the Taliban, simply because the Barakzai decided, the Barakzai tribe collectively, led by a powerful member of parliament, decided collectively that they will no longer be part of the provincial state, and they had strong grievances there. In Faryab, similar cases where local people raising their grievances, lacking voice, and then the central government, the Kabul, trying to impose its own will on the population. the power transformation in Kandahar has been fascinating, in a fascinating shift from 3 tribes suddenly to domination of power by 2 tribes in Kandahar. And every time those cycles are repeating in terms of transformation of power dynamics. In places like Kandahar, what we are seeing is the Nurzais, who have historically been discriminated against, emerging as the powerful. In fact, a colleague of mine from a Nurzai tribe used to joke that within the Republic, I would never get to be the president. But within the Taliban rank, I could easily become the leader of the Taliban movement. And he was making a point. He had a point. The system was exceptionally discriminatory, inherently prejudiced against certain groups of people. So the third one is containing local conflict. That we have never done really well. And the question is, technically, how do you come up with policies that would enable us to contain those local level conflicts, that a conflict between the Nurzais and the Popalzais in Panjwai Kandahar does not transform into a national conflict where it would bring in Karzais and it would bring in the leadership of Taliban, okay? Or in places like Uruzgan between the Hazaras and the Pashtuns, or between other tribes. Thirdly, how do you bring service delivery closer to the people and give them the ability to have voice and oversight over the process? That again, to some extent, we tried through the Citizen Charter Program, National Solidarity Program, but we were not effective. They were not embedded as part of the constitution in Afghanistan. What we tried, and again, I'm sorry, I'm speaking longer here. What we tried, and again, President Karzai had a vision in 2017, 16 and 17. He wanted to give in some of his own power from the palace, at least along 5 key areas of education, water management, health, road management, and so forth, to the district level.
Karzai or Ghani?
Ghani.
Okay.
But from 2018 onwards, he shifted back to rapid centralization, or alter centralization, which again would be one of the reasons for the contributing reason for the collapse of the Republic, rapid collapse of the Republic, because more and more spaces lost, communities lost voice and representation. And again, the Taliban are making the same mistake in terms of, well, they haven't had the chance to make significant appointments in places like Kandahar. In fact, the Haqqanis tried to appoint a provincial police chief a month ago, and they were not successful. The Kandaharis rejected that. We're seeing similar cases where local Taliban commanders are rejecting Kabul, and in fact, that is the key to the stability of Taliban so far, because they have remained decentralized at the provincial level. As soon as they try to centralize and one faction or one group starts dominating, we'll see the slide towards civil war.
So when you say decentralized, that the Taliban, I just want to make sure I understand this, that the Taliban are behaving in a more decentralized manner at the provincial level. This means that they are allowing provincial governors to dictate who they are appointing at the subnational level. I think that's what he means. And as soon as these appointments are taken out of the provincial government's hand and given to Kabul, then we begin to see conflict. Khalid, is that your understanding as well?
I believe that when the takeover took place, so many of those initially the takeover took place because Taliban already had those different commissions. They had the military commission, they had education commission, they had the NGOs commission, rural development, almost identical to the government ministerial structure. They had that structure, and then when the takeover took place, actually those commissions took over, and also they had that provincial structure, administrative structure. They had the appointed governors, the police chief for the province and military. They had those structures, and those structures took over kind of that former government structure, and they replaced them. But more after the takeover, we see a gradual trend of central government is exerting its influence, that they are changing some of the provincial governors. They are replacing some of those police chief on the provincial level. They are introducing other changes. Or the Taliban structure, the commission structure was very lean one, and that could not replace the whole government structure. They are also making new. So I do see a trend that the Taliban central government is moving more and more towards centralizing those appointments. But I also see that so far they seem like a decentralized structure, but that was because of that takeover. I would not link it much to the Taliban's policy of decentralization. However, we have clearly heard from the Taliban spokespersons that they are indicating towards a stronger influence of central government in Afghanistan. And when it comes to the resistance that you asked earlier, of course, I mean, there are a number of things that are quite crucial in regards to what direction the country is taking in future. And that is the inclusivity of the government, diversity in the government, which kind of are prerequisites for that legitimization of the state in Afghanistan. They are very crucial. If those aspects of the government and also people's voice and representation, as Timur was referring to, as a Taliban or not yet, quite familiar with the importance of that the voice and participation of the communities have. They are much more into that enforcing rules and regulations and laws and ways of thinking. So these are not only important for the international legitimization, but these are also important because one of the potential future scenarios is that if these aspects are not tackled, the country will move towards a civil war. That is the next scenario that can be predicted, and there is quite a lot of ground to predict that the country is moving towards that direction. But there are also opportunities to minimize the prospects of the civil of the country moving into civil war and a complete collapse, which would triple the current crisis and the situation that the Afghans are facing. So in one word, that inclusivity and diversity, that is the key that the Taliban need to address.
Great, Francis, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, just a quick point and more really a question I'm watching, and I certainly don't have the answers, but to Khalid's point on this conversation on the center versus periphery balance and decentralization versus not, I take Khalid's point entirely. There's a desire to centralize. At the same time, I'm really interested in this question of, we know resources are contracting very much. There are fewer resources and therefore less patronage to bestow. Historically, the way the center actually, exerts some control over the periphery is by bestowal of patronage resources. So as those resources contract, is there a move towards granting local commanders, local power brokers more autonomy as a sort of compensation for that? I've heard some anecdotal reports that may be the case in some places. I suspect, like everything in Afghan local governance these days, it's varied depending on the locality. But I am interested in this question of will there be more local autonomy granted just because there's less patronage to go around at this point?
To link that to an overall policy trend within the Taliban government, it is difficult to establish that at the moment. But of course, it matters if we reflect upon the situation into the first years of the Republic during Karzai's time. It depended on who is the provincial governor. Let's take the example of Gul Agha Sherzai, who was the governor of Kandahar. So he was having a lot of influence over the local resources, or over the local administration compared to another province. And that trend also is seen in the current government. It very much depends on who the provincial governor is, and what influence and position that provincial governor had during this 20 years of fight, and what military and political influence he had within the Taliban. So it varies from province to province, from locality to locality, and it has to do a lot with who is in power in that particular province. But there is no, to my understanding, there is no clear policy trend to establish that the Taliban are moving more and more to granting local autonomy.
So along these lines, there's a question from Ellen Lust here about the way the Taliban is governing those areas that it had controlled for a long period of time. So as many of us know, that the Taliban, the insurgency went on for 20 years, and there's some parts of the country that they had actually had very strong control over for many years. What is this, how is the rise of the Taliban to national power affecting governance in those areas where they have already been in control? Khalid, I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Okay, yes, of course. There were many districts, villages, majority of the villages in many parts of the country were under control of Taliban. And then the schools were running there, the health facilities were running there, and so many good things were also happening in those areas. Swedish Committee for Afghanistan was also running schools, clinics, and also supporting the community-based civil society structures in those communities. And there was the shadow government authorities and the communities' engagement on many issues. So with a change, the access has relieved into those areas. Before, there were so many access constraints. There were so many security risks. So with a takeover, the access not only to those areas, but all over Afghanistan has eased and relieved. And also the other thing that we can notice is that the increased demand to the services, not only in those areas that were formerly controlled by the Taliban, but all over Afghanistan. There is increased demand for the services, not only because of this as one of the effects of the decreased development or aid, but rather that there are prospects and possibilities for the communities to raise their voice and ask for more services in those areas. But when it comes to one of the prominent differences in the areas that were formerly controlled by the Taliban. There is a relative stabilization trend in those areas compared to those areas that have recently come under control of Taliban after August 15, because in these new areas, they are in the process of consolidating their power, in consolidating their governance in these new areas. While in those areas that were controlled by them from very long ago, they had that time for consolidating power and exercising their governance approaches in modalities. That is one of the notable differences.
Great. Francis Ellen Lust has a second question here related to service provision. I'm wondering if you could tackle this. The point that you make about local governance and service provision, so the same might be said about the inability to separate politics and humanitarian aid. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yes, Professor Lust, I completely agree with the premise of the question. And I think this is really important because I speak only as an expert on the international community and the donor side, but right now the policy conversations here in Washington, where I am, and elsewhere are really around trying to parse a distinction between humanitarian aid versus so-called humanitarian plus versus long-term development aid. And because of the political complications of supporting sort of long-term development in a Taliban-run Afghanistan, here in Washington in particular, there's much more comfort with humanitarian aid as defined as humanitarian aid. That said, as you rightly point out, humanitarian aid affects local politics. It injects resources locally, and I think there's no way to really carefully cauterize out what will be humanitarian assistance directly to Afghan citizens versus a resource injection that will affect the Taliban, power structure or ecosystem in some way. So I don't have a very comfortable answer to this. I think we here in Washington just haven't or are not going to be comfortable with really reconciling with that. At the same time, the humanitarian needs are immense and urgent. The economic crisis, as my co-panelists have mentioned, is dire. So I think it is a sort of the need to move ahead anyway. Of course, working through local organizations, working with local organizations with great reach throughout the country will help. I think that's very important. I'm very much in favor of more humanitarian aid and humanitarian plus aid. I just think we from the international side need to be really modest about how much visibility we will really have on sort of what happens downstream. We had very little visibility on very far-reaching parts of Afghanistan when we had an immense presence in Kabul or at the regional commands level. I think, now our visibility is even less. And that brings me to my last sort of recommendation to your question. For the donor side, I think my top recommendation really is we need much more baseline information on what is going on right now. We have just very little visibility in general as our presence has receded or left. So general purpose monitoring is something that's come up in other conversations. Just we've got a real blind spot here. And I think for us to make responsible assistance decisions, we just need much more visibility right now and more research, which I know will be in keeping with GLD's mission.
Yeah, and along these lines, it's really amazing how little we know about what's going on inside of Afghanistan. And a reason for this is the media that was really sort of the backbone of so much information over the past 20 years. The incredible, vibrant media, has really been decimated. We've seen, some of the major media outlets in Washington are still ticking, but there was just a report came out this morning from Human Rights Watch that described how media at the subnational level has been really, really decimated by these efforts. And so without that vibrant local media that was really feeding so much of these narratives, it's so hard for us to know what's happening inside the country. It's really hard to know whether the Taliban will allow survey enumerators to work. I'm hearing mixed things from people. We have just one question here. Let's see. Unintended consequences. So I think, is this Ellen's question? I'm just seeing a question in the chat pop up. Yeah, do we think that the international donor community, I think this is for both of you before we wrap up here, if you just want to make any final comments about lessons learned, things that the international community can do differently as it seeks to engage and support communities at the subnational level. Khalid, I'll turn this over to you.
I mean, one of the comparative advantages of the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan, of working in Afghanistan for close to 40 years, has been its longer term commitment to the people of Afghanistan, and also working very closely with the local communities, with those different community-based structures that were active in those communities. So that high level of acceptance and ownership and putting the communities in the driving seat to kind of drive their development, that makes many things possible, and above all, contextual. That also is very important. The contextual mode of development and delivery, and that can be achieved in working very closely with the local communities and those different structures. Those possibilities are still there. Because so far the Taliban are lacking so many policies on central level, and there are those pockets of influence open on local level to shape and contribute to the Taliban policies development. And then the local administrations. If I give an example, after the takeover, the girls' secondary schools were closed. They in many provinces, Swedish Committee provincial teams, together with the communities, engaged with the Taliban provincial administrations, and within short, all the Swedish Committee supported schools in almost all provinces. The girls up to grade 9 and 11 and 12, they started to return back to the school, despite the fact that it was not officially. So there is a lot of room for engagement, for dialogue, and also reaching and finding solutions to many of the issues, if the communities are involved and if there is constructive dialogue and engagement on local level, and those possibilities are still there.
Great, Frances.
So I'd say 2 or 3 quick recommendations going forward for my colleagues on the international side. Number one, and this is sort of a big policy issue, but just we on the international side need a much more strategic long-term political plan in general. I think it will come as no surprise to this audience that we have been somewhat on the back foot for the last year, really, as regards Afghanistan, first making the decision to withdraw, then withdrawing and all the drama around that, then evacuations, and now really scrambling to keep up with sort of the changing circumstances, the economic and humanitarian crisis. So we have not devoted the bandwidth, I don't think, to really develop a longer term a strategic approach going forward. And that is needed for reasons of local governance and everything else that affects Afghans' lives on the ground. So that's number one in the high level. On the as regards subnational governance and what the international community should do going forward, I think my number one recommendation is really that we be much more modest about what we know and what we can reasonably do. Even in the heyday of local bottom-up endeavors in Afghanistan, and I think of the surge, the so-called surge era around 2009, 2011, where there was a lot of rightful attention on local governance issues, there was still never really a sober grappling with the fact that there were upwards of 30,000 communities in Afghanistan, and we on the international side could never actually feasibly engage with all of them in in an equitable manner and an effective manner. There was never really an integration as regards stabilization. There was never really an integration of other lessons from other community-driven development programs beyond NSP elsewhere that really told us what could and couldn't be achieved by these local efforts. So I think a lot of our efforts have been tokenistic when it comes to local governance engagement. And I think now modesty is even more in order because our reach is so limited, our visibility is limited. But then that brings me to my last point, which is more of a silver lining. And it actually dovetails on Khalid's. Just because we can't engage effectively everywhere in Afghanistan doesn't mean we shouldn't try to seek out positive pockets, windows of opportunity where we can affect positive change on local governance issues or, just local issues that affect people. So I like the idea of sort of pockets where you could make headway. So I think if we can identify those and make a positive difference in some places, recognizing, as we've discussed, that local injection of resources leads to unintended local political consequences, and we need to be careful. I still think there's a lot that can be done, and I certainly hope that we move forward in that spirit. That's it.
Great, thank you. And along these lines, the only thing I wish is, along what Francis and Khalid have suggested, is just something more pragmatic, more realistic, something that really does engage communities. But engaging local governance is different from engaging communities. And I think what we've seen in Afghanistan over the past 20 years is a desire to engage communities, but actually very little to strengthen local governance. And in fact, you could argue that there is no local governance in Afghanistan. You have a highly centralized government that only has representatives of national level institutions present at the subnational level, that there is no subnational representation at the local level. And this means that building local governance is very, very challenging. And it means the stability of the country is always at risk, because under any of these regimes, and I think this is important point to underscore, is what we're seeing right now, and the speakers have highlighted this, is continuity. We're not seeing huge amounts of institutional change. We're seeing changes of who's in power, but not necessarily changing the way that power has been executed. When I started visiting Afghanistan almost 20 years ago, there were 15,000 communities in the country. That's what the government said. And as aid was allocated to communities, the number of communities suddenly proliferated. The international community created incentives there are more. In the United States, we have 50,000 subnational government units. These include school districts, police forces, and local government units. 50,000 in a country as large as the United States. International aid really incentivized the proliferation of so much subnational governance in terms of villages that the government recognized because of aid. And I do hope that as aid dries up, it's going to be very painful for people, but I do hope that a silver lining of this is a government that's much more rational, that is affordable for Afghanistan in the long run, and that can be sustained. What the government currently has is not sustainable. And I think it's going to undermine a lot of things, including service delivery, because it's just not, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So that is my contribution to this discussion. I want to thank Francis and Khalid for their contributions. I want to thank Timur, who had to leave us earlier. Sadly, his son was not feeling well. Thanks to Jennifer Bergman for organizing this conference. Really appreciated all the hard work that you put into this. And finally, thank you, Ellen Lust, for bringing us all together and giving us this platform today.
Thank you.
you all.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.